Hello, my name is Sarah Pfundstein from the Indiana State Library's Genealogy Collection, and today I'm talking to you about immigration and naturalization. If your family member entered at any time, pretty much any time until 1950 into the United States, they most likely came over by boat. So we'll be talking about immigration, that part of immigration. Immigration records generally consist of colonial lists, original passenger lists, customs passenger lists, crew lists, and immigration passenger lists. Colonial lists, they're not kept at the National Archives. The Port of Philadelphia had good record keeping during the colonial period. The main part of these records were baggage lists, which began in January of 1800. These were done primarily by cargo vessels to exempt paying duty on personal belongings. Names of passengers were written on the bottom of these lists. The majority of immigrants in these passenger lists were German or Irish. There are also captain's lists for the Port of Philadelphia from 1727 to 1808, and these are maintained by the Pennsylvania State Archives. Original lists are scattered in various locations. They were at one time located at the National Archives and will vary as to what information is provided since they were not uniform. They did not keep uniform records from port to port. Quite a few in Philadelphia, they were transferred to the Temple Balloch Institute in Philadelphia. The Baltimore City's lists and Boston's prior to 1883 were destroyed. The Galveston lists from 1872 to 1895 are incomplete. Most are missing. Part of the Baltimore list were later found, but the originals were destroyed after microfilming. In Boston, there was an alien passenger list that required a bond of indemnity or a payment of $2 for each passenger landed from abroad. Another list includes State Department transcripts between 1819 and 1832, which lists each passenger by port of arrival and then name. A typical entry would include the passenger's age, their sex, occupation, and name of country from which he belonged, and the country where they intended to become a resident. The National Archives does have some records for the Port of New Orleans from 1813 to 1819 and Philadelphia from 1800 to 1819. Customs lists, passenger lists, these of course were regulated by the Bureau of Customs. In 1819, Congress passed an act that required captains of vessels coming into U.S. ports from other countries to submit a list of passengers to the Collector of Customs at the port of entry. The law went into effect on January 1st, 1820. A large portion of these lists are available on microfilm if you prefer to use microfilm in record group number 36. Included were the major ports of Baltimore, Boston, New Orleans, New York, and Philadelphia. The master of the ship was supposed to submit a list or manifest of all passengers to the Collector of Customs. It was to include age, sex, occupation, and country that they belonged, the name of the ship they were on, the name of port that they left from, the date and port of arrival, a passenger's name, again. In New York, customs passenger lists were compiled from 1820 to June 1897. There's also a register of vessels arriving at the Port of New York from foreign ports from 1789 to 1919. It comprised of two parts. The list is the most complete list available for ships that entered New York Harbor during those dates. The following types of information are usually found on the list for each of the vessel. The name of the vessel, the country of origin, type of rig, date of entry, master's name, and the last port that they embarked from. The first series would cover from the period August 5th, 1789 to December 30th, 1899. The second series covers January 3rd, 1860 to December 31st, 1899. We do have those on microfilm, and they are most likely also on Ancestry as well. We will discuss Castle Garden, Ellis Island later when we discuss immigration websites. For the Port of New Orleans, passenger lists are taken from manifests of customs services from 1813 to 1867. Many New Orleans passenger lists were in a combination of French, Spanish, and German. A lot of times they were actually less expensive. It was less expensive to travel to New Orleans in the winter because the different lines would offer services so that they could have full ships traveling to the U.S. where they would then grab goods and take them back to Europe. So so being less expensive, it might have been a more attractive port to some immigrants because of the price. We do have some of the quarterly abstracts for vessels arriving in New York. We have their indexes, as well as to the city passenger list for Baltimore and federal passenger lists from 1828 to 1897. On microfilm, there were custom collection districts that were established for more than 100 coastal river, Great Lakes, and inland ports. Other indexes you could check are the supplemental index to passenger lists of vessels arriving at the Atlantic and Gulf Coast ports, excluding New York from 1820 to 1874. An example of some custom papers of where the person, when the date, the master of the certain ship, they left from Bremen, and they sworn that everything he has submitted is correct in August 1856. Crew lists. Some people have stories in their family of an immigrant ancestor who may have worked his way onto a crew and worked on a ship and then jumped ship. In America, the expression jump ship does not mean they literally jumped from ship to ship, but they had entered the U.S. without legal documentation. Crew lists include both American and alien seamen. The amount of information varies on the crew members. Some types of information include length of service at sea, position in the ship's company, when and where they join the ship's crew, discharged at the port of arrival, age, race, nationality, height, weight, and literacy. Those lists are available at the National Archive. And of course, there is a list below, as you can see on your slide, that would show the time frames for some of the various ports with crew lists. So it will vary. There's some of them that are later, so there's not a lot of earlier ones that are available at the National Archives. Immigration passenger lists. Shortly after the establishment of Ellis Island, there was the beginning of the immigration passenger lists. Unlike custom passenger lists, which were regulated by customs officials in the various ports, the regulation of the list at this time period was maintained by a government agency, which changed. It was under various federal control throughout the years. As you can see here again, it's under the Department of Treasury, then Commerce, Labor, Justice, and now Homeland Security. So those are available. We have some of them on microfilm as well, if you're interested in microfilm. The types of information listed on the passenger list during this period became more and more extensive. In addition to the usual information such as name, age, sex, occupation, and nationality, where the record now included marital status, last residence, final destination, the U.S. If they were ever in the U.S. before, when, where, and for how long were they in the U.S. They're going to join a relative. They'd want the relative's name, address, and relationship to the alien, whether they were able to read and write, train ticket, if they had a train ticket to their final destination, the amount of money the passenger was carrying, whether the passenger had ever been in a prison, an almshouse, or institution. For the insane, or was a polygamist. In 1903, race was added, followed in 1906 with more physical descriptive terms. In 1907, the name and address of the closest living relative in the native country was given. There are also special situations that include birth and deaths at sea and stowaways. Sometimes there was a record of aliens held for special inquiry in infirmaries, for medical reasons that were denied entrance to the U.S. There are various search strategies for looking for passenger lists. Of course, the immigrant's name, date of birth, ethnic group, date of arrival, and port of arrival are important. With the immigrant's name, sometimes they were recorded just as they sounded, so phonetically. So if you have a German ancestor, or especially someone speaking another language, usually it was recorded by, it wasn't always recorded by someone who spoke the same language. So they would just spell it as it sounded to them. If a person had a name that was spelled in Cyrillic, there could of course be translation issues when it was changed into Latin. Some families would have different spellings for the same name, and there's spelling variations that you'll see nowadays. And then of course, with women in certain women's names, certain countries, women conducted business under their maiden names. So they may have been married, but they still kept their old name. So if you see them, it would be next to their husband and possibly children, but they would be a lady with a different name as well. So you'll want to think about that when you're looking. If they were from a country where it was common to keep the maiden name on forms, you may have to look for them under that. Date of birth is important because you want to be able to distinguish your John Smith from somebody else's John Smith, if at all possible, or at least narrow down the number of results. So knowing the date of birth or approximate date is helpful in trying to narrow down your person. Ethnic groups, depending on where they're from, that can play a large part in when and where they would have migrated. You would want to know the political history of the European area of origin. If there was a war going on, a famine, things like that, why someone might have left, political unrest, things like that, religious persecution, local naming of customs of naming. If there was a local, like if they named people after first son after a paternal father, second son after maternal father, things like that, maternal grandfather. If you know those naming customs, it might be easier to differentiate who the person you're looking for, and if they are who you are looking for with regards to your person. A date of arrival. If your ancestor lived, at least like in the 1900 census, it would show date of arrival on the census. Sometimes you can find them, you'd want to look at census records to see when they start showing up in the census. If you have access to state census records that would fall between regular census records and would include information about when they came there, you could guess approximately when they might have entered the United States. Also, you'd want to think about looking at naturalization records, if you know where those are, to see when that process started, and if you know the rules for naturalization at the time when each part was filed, you can guess approximately when they would have shown up. Sometimes the first thing you might find for a person, you might also want to look at marriage records and things like that if they pop up. They may get married a couple years after coming to America as well. So you'd want to look for different records to see if you can pin down approximately when they show up in the U.S. Port of arrival, obviously you want to check the indexed ports first. It's just easy. Parts of some of the ports are not indexed on microfilm, although I believe Ancestry is covering most of that. So they should be available that way. Then you'd want to go through the unindexed ports and look at the approximate time periods for the person's name. You can also look under the ship's name if you know what ship they came on. Um, There are problems, though, with the National Archives lists. Passenger lists were often destroyed before indexing because they just didn't see the need in keeping them. Original lists, if they are available, are often not in good condition because of different attitudes towards preservation. Names on the lists are unreadable. Not everyone had great penmanship, so some parts, or they may be smudged, or there may be damage on them, so they're not legible. The name in the index, of course, could be different from the name in the list because someone was just recording, and obviously there are human errors. You can also look for a companion's name or another family member's name, of course, if they traveled in a group, or if you suspected they traveled in a group. You could also look at other ports to see if you can find them. With immigration sources, if you know the port of departure, you can look in certain European lists. They're not complete. Of course, World War I and II raged havoc on different ports, and of course bombings and things like that. So not all are complete, and some have been destroyed. But you can check Bremen and Hamburg. Those were both very popular ports, especially with Germans. Le Havre might also have been popular depending on the area they lived in, or Antwerp. That could be another spot to look. Some of the Hamburg passenger lists have survived. The original passenger list covering the years from 1850 to 1934 are preserved in the German State Archives in Hamburg. The list and index cover 517 volumes. Allen County has a copy on microfilm of those records as well. Again, this would be, if you know where the person came from, it would kind of help you figure out which port they might have gone to, because depending on where they lived in Europe, certain areas were easier to get to either by boat as opposed to overland travel. You'd also want to think about trains were not available to everyone at all times, so they would have gone different routes than you might think of now, because the types of transportation were not available to them. We do have books on immigration, of course. Here there are some, though we do have some on microfilm as well as our databases and websites. Of course, we have on book Famine Immigrants, Germans to America. We have from 1840 onward, Italians to America, Migration from the Russian Empire, the Württemberg Immigration Index, Czech immigration passenger lists, Swedish passenger arrivals in the U.S. Those are all available. You may also want to think about other special resources that could help you with your immigrant search. For example, a newspaper at port of entry around the date of arrival may give you information on the ship and perhaps passengers. The New York Times Marine Intelligence column would be one place to look for this. If your ancestor came over from Canada overland, no lists were necessarily kept by the U.S. Joint inspection cards were established in 1891. Records of these border entries through 1954 are maintained by the National Archives. There were various laws, of course. You want to think about the various laws passed by the U.S. Congress to regulate flow of immigrants to the country, particularly Asians coming through the West Coast. Records like that would also be available at the National Archives. But if there were certain quotas on types of different groups of people, that could affect when they might have entered into the U.S. Websites. Of course, Ancestry. More and more is being put up on Ancestry, but you can check their immigration and travel section. They do have passenger lists as well as citizenship and naturalization records, border crossings, crew lists, and other ship pictures and other things available. New York passenger lists are available. You can even search if you know the date by date, or if you know the role, the month, the day, ship. You can put in all sorts of information if you know that and look at the lists. Ship lists are available. If you know the date of arrival, you can narrow down the number of what ship it would have been on, or perhaps you know the ship. You can check through by each ship. You're able to drill down if you prefer. The Bond Immigration Index is also available on Ancestry, and you can search that as well. Hamburg, there's some of it available. You can search that. You can browse the collection. It's not completely done, so you'd have to look through letter by letter, but it is available to look at on Ancestry. And some countries have taken an interest in the people that have immigrated from their country to the U.S., and so especially Germany, you'll find some of the local archives have lists of people who left their part of Germany to the U.S. or other countries, and they will have some sort of search engine or database available. Bremerhaven, the Bremerhaven Immigration Center has different, they have information there, as well as an entire museum dedicated to people who left Germany for America. So it's a nice little museum to look at. Their website's very nice. They also have records as well. And you can go through there under collection and research. Ellis Island. Ellis Island, not everyone went through Ellis Island when they came in. So only a fraction of the people who went into New York did. But you can look at their foundation. They have a passenger search list, which you can search by just last name, or if they're more common, by their first name or just first initial, depending on the spelling, whether or not it may have been butchered. Castle Garden came before Ellis Island, so you can search there. They do have a little search database, and you can figure out whether your person entered there. Cyndi's List, I always recommend Cyndi's List for anything, just because it's a lovely, quick, they aggregate a bunch of different resources in one spot. So you might find something you just had overlooked and not realized you were looking for there. It will tell you whether or not the site is free or will cost you, but you can get an idea of what is available to you. And they do have a ship and passenger list section, as well as an immigration and migration section. So you can look under different categories and things like that and find all sorts of stuff out. The National Archives also has immigration records, again, and they will have a section in their website about immigration and what stuff is available and what has been digitized. Family Search, they have Germans to America 1850 to 1897 available online, so that's a bit easier than searching through all the books. So if your family member came through at that time, between that time period, it might be worth a look. They also have the Philadelphia passenger list from 1800 to 1882, and it'll tell you what, if it's from the National Archives, what it corresponds to. So if they're under that, you can search under the person's name. And after they immigrated to the U.S., a lot of them became naturalized, so we're going to talk about naturalizations. There are multiple ways of becoming a citizen. The most common are by birth in the U.S., so anyone born here is currently a citizen of the United States. They can be naturalized in a court and exercising naturalization jurisdiction. They could receive it by the naturalization of their parents if they are underage, or by marriage to a citizen. Or if they're born on a military base, they receive it at birth through a citizen parent, or if they're born in another country, they become citizens of the U.S. Additional ways they can become a citizen: if there's legislation passed collectively naturalizing certain groups of people, for various reasons. They could be naturalized that way or by annexation of a certain territory to the United States. In colonial times, only a few people who were naturalized were from the continent of Europe. Mostly English, Welsh, Irish, and Scottish people moved to the colonies. We're just going from one empire to the other. So people that were naturalized went by the provisions of English law prior to 1776. They must be Protestant. They had to live in the colony for 7 years, and they had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. Prior to 1906, any court could naturalize, such as a civil, probate, or chancery court. So depending on the area, you'll want to look at the different courts available. It wasn't until September 27, 1906, that federal courts got involved with the naturalization process, and there were more uniform standards. Naturalization cases in one geographical area were not necessarily exclusive to one court. They could be in multiple, you could find records in multiple different courts. The Naturalization Act of 1802 established the three-part naturalization process that is still in use, starting with the Declaration of Intention, the petition, and the Certificate of Naturalization. There was also a report and registry of aliens that was required between 1798 to 1828 as part of the naturalization process, and they do that with before and with the Declaration of Intention. For the registry, they had to report, again, between 1798 and 1828. The report and the declaration had to be filed with a court before they could be granted citizenship. They had to be filed by a person of age, which at the time was 21, or if they were under that age, by a parent, guardian, master, or mistress. On the East Coast, the application of registry was separate from the Declaration of Intention, and if the person moved, certificates of the registry and the declaration were issued when the alien moved. In non-coastal towns, registries and declarations were issued as one document in the 1820s. And after May 24th, 1828, they repealed the registry requirement. The contents of the registry would include name, birth date, age, nation and allegiance of each alien, country where they migrated from, place of intended settlement. Declaration of Intention, they of course used it from 1795 to 1952. After that, you could just do it voluntarily. An alien filed a statement or oath that it was their intention to become a citizen and renounce all foreign allegiance. And of course, the contents were varied until they were standardized in 1906. The declaration could be issued in one location with the petition and certificate of naturalization issued in another, especially if they filed their declaration in their port, the port of call that they entered in on, and then moved inland to be with family or for a better economic situation. The forms would vary from year to year. Of course, if it's handwritten, the document's subject to interpretation because it's a little bit harder it can be a little bit harder to read. The place of birth and or date of arrival were left blank or guessed due to immigrant not knowing their birth date, or they forgot when they arrived. The petition or second papers, before an alien could complete the petition or final papers, they had to complete residency requirements. It varied. For the most part, it was 5 years, but there was a time period between 1798 and 1802 when they had to live here for 14 years to gain residency requirements. The petitions can be hard to find. Sometimes they're in a court's permanent record. Some separate ledgers for petitions are rare, and they're more valuable after 1906. Certificate of Naturalization. That was recorded in the order of the court. Written testimony that rights have been conferred, and of course it was kept as a separate record after 1906. Early certificates were given to the applicant. After 1906, there were specific requirements Certificate of arrival, it shows the date, place, and manner of the alien's arrival into U.S. It was required after 1906, and before 1929, it was part of the Petition for Naturalization. After 1929, it was attached to the Declaration of Intention. You had to be at least 18 years old to file the Declaration of Intention to a clerk of court. There was no prescribed period of residence, and there were 3 copies given out after you filed your declaration. One was kept by the court, the other was kept by the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the last one was kept by the person themselves. And then when you would surrender that part back to the court at the time of the petition. But if for some reason the ancestor still has the declaration in the family that was issued after 1906, it might be because the petition was not made or the declaration had expired later than they had waited more than 7 years to file. The petition of naturalization, the Declaration of Intention had to be kept for at least 2 years before you could file for petition, but not more than 7 years. Once you did that, marital history, present and past marriages needed to be recorded, and where the children resided. Places of residency needed to be recorded to establish the residency requirement. And the certificate of citizenship was filed by serial number, and it was filed by serial number, certificate, or consecutively numbered. Old law, it was part of the old law before September 27, 1906. Later naturalizations were done and had 3 parts to them. The original was given to the citizen, the duplicate sent to Washington, D.C., and the stub was retained by the county court. Of course, not everyone completed the naturalization process. Aliens did not always do 3 steps. Some felt that the Declaration of Intention was all that was needed. Sometimes they returned to their homeland after filing the petition and never came back. Some engaged in naturalization fraud so they could vote or for employment reasons. And in 1905, you could vote with just the Declaration of Intention in 9 states. Derivative citizenship. So minors have became citizens automatically by naturalization of the parents, and that was going on since 1790. Between 1824 and 1906, a child who had lived in the U.S. for 5 years could file both the Declaration of Intention along with their petition together, as long as they'd lived here 5 years if the parent had not. Name and age appeared on the petition for naturalization and certificate of citizenship, where derivative citizenship was based. Women. There were some special laws for women during the time period along with derivative citizenship. From 1855 to 1922, any woman who became a citizen automatically if they married an American. So, but prior to 1907, an American woman who married a foreign, an alien man and still resided in the U.S. did not lose her citizenship. The Expatriation Act of 1907, though, mandated that any woman who marries a foreigner shall take the nationality of her husband. So quite a number of women lost their American citizenship because they married someone who was not a citizen. Of course, the Cable Act of 1922 tried to tried to mitigate any of this by saying any woman who married a foreigner after September 22nd, 1922 would not lose citizenship. But women who were still married prior to this date were considered non-citizens, and if they wanted to become citizens would have to go through the whole process again to become citizens. But at the same time, an alien woman could skip the Declaration of Intention and just do a naturalization petition. And it wasn't until July 2nd, 1940 that Congress passed a law that allowed all to regain their citizenship. So they were able to fill out a form if they had married a foreign man. So they could, again, become U.S. citizens. So citizenships based on military service. During the Civil War, there was an act that Anyone age 21 or older who was enlisted or may enlist in the armies of the U.S., either the regulars or the volunteers, and they were honorably discharged, would be admitted as a citizen of the U.S. for their service. In 1894, they extended citizenship to anyone who had served in the Navy after 5 years of service or the Marines after a year of service. Of course, there were different registrations during World War I. We had a lot of people coming in from different countries, so there were 3 registrations. One was in 1917 and 2 were later in 1918. The information required would be the name, date of birth, if native born, whether a native born, naturalized, or an alien, their declaration of intention. What nation were they a citizen? Did they want to be a citizen of? And then, of course, during the time period, during the war, aliens in the registry process would have different fates. Friendly aliens, of course, could be asked to serve, especially after beginning the process. So if they were if they were from a country that we were not at war with, they could be asked to fight. However, enemy aliens, those born in a country that we were currently at war at, would not have to serve. There was an act in May 9th, 1918. Any World War I veterans while serving in the conflict could file a petition. They didn't have to file the declaration, and they did not have to show a 5-year residency. They would be naturalized at their military camps and not at home residence. And they would not be done at home. They would all be done within the camp or base that they were stationed. Some people would become naturalized based on land. In Indiana, by an act of January 14th, 1818, aliens could purchase land if doing the Declaration of Intention and Naturalization process. So this was an incentive for a lot of people who could not own land in the old country. So if they became a citizen, they could. Other states, such as New York, had similar requirements. This was federalized. The Homestead Act of 1862. So as part of the requirement for land purchase, you had to be on your way to be a citizen. Strategies for finding naturalization records. It's a good book by John Newman that has a lot of information in there. You want to check the census, and of course, check the census and other records to look for the person. If they lived till 1900, it would show when approximately they arrived and how long they'd been living in the U.S. So that could give you a clue as to when and where to look. And you'd also want to look at the places they listed as former residences to prove they're in the U.S. for 5 years. But yeah, you want to look around to see where people were living, and you'd want to check the different areas to see if, especially before 1906, to see if they had started any part of the process in these areas, in the cities that they may have been living in, or the towns. Of course, if you're looking for people, just like any other ethnic group, you want to look for, see if they're living near neighbors from the old country. A lot of times people traveled in groups, not just family groups, but people from the same town would often travel over to the U.S. together. People in the same church. Currently, they might be going to a church with a lot of people who are from the same ethnic group in the same area. Again, studying population movements can give clues, can give you an idea of where they may have started out, where they may have landed, and then where they may have later settled. If you're looking for certain groups of immigrants, there were large centers of different groups in different areas, like Cleveland, Chicago, Cincinnati, just depending on the ethnic group. And then you would want to look at events that involved education, military, and social and cultural activities in the person's life that may have had an effect on where they were living or where they might have become naturalized. When you're looking at naturalization information, you want to see, is it complete? Is it just a summary or even just an abstract? Is the date contemporary with the event? Is the record the official record of the office holder? This is where you're looking at an original or a copy, because a copy, of course, someone can interpret it in any way. It may not be completely correct. And then what would the reason be behind for the naturalization? Are they looking for land? Are they doing it for other reasons, such as voter fraud? You, of course, want to keep in mind the time and place and how it relates to the naturalization law in effect at the time. And again, was the naturalization related to wanting to vote, if they were in the military in any number of the wars, or again, were they trying to purchase land? Of course, you want to remember the evolution of the federal immigration control. So it went through, of course, a number of different departments, and depending on who it was in control of, that might give you an idea of to where some records could be located. So if they were naturalized while it was part of the Department of Commerce, you might have to look through some of their records to find things, to see if there might be information in certain areas. Of course, as it was federalized, things did change, so you would want to keep that in mind. At the State Library and the State Archives, we do have some naturalization indexes, especially some people on their own time did certain parts of certain counties. In Indiana, we do have some stuff in print. And they're microfilm copies for many counties if you'd like to use those. You can check the site index for the ISL homepage and the county records. You can also check our online catalog for records. We are also a Family Search affiliate, so if you want to look at records, if there are records that are of interest in another, not even Indiana, but another state that are available through the Family Search website that have been digitized, you can do that in our library. There are a number of states that are available. They've stopped microfilm. They've stopped sending out microfilm, so it'd be nice. It's a nice place to look, not only for Indiana information, but for information for ancestors in other states. Copies of Indiana naturalization records were sent from the counties to the Indiana State Archives. So they have an index. You can search, searchable by name for many counties. It's not completely comprehensive because not everyone, of course, was naturalized in the naturalization records. They may have been naturalized in another book. There is a book put out by the Indiana Historical Society. It's an index to immigrants in the other counties that is not in the naturalization records. So they're in like probate records or civil records, things like that. And that's another, you can check that index as well to see if they are possibly located there. And those records, generally a lot of those records have been digitized and are available through Family Search, which you can come and look at the library. There are a number of websites you can look at, of course. There's the digital archives from the state archives, and you can search naturalization records by first name, last name, and they have some good records there. If you find them, you can contact them for the full information. They have those available. National Archives, of course, has a lot of information about naturalization records on their website, and you can go through their information, and it can tell you where to find things, especially they're more useful for things after 1906. The records for different district courts are held by their local archives, so the ones for this area would be found in Chicago. And so if you're looking for anyone from Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, or Wisconsin, and they were done in district court, there's a finding aid for that. And they have a list of the different districts, the city, and what years they have for petition indexes, declaration of intention, petitions, things like that. And then, of course, nowadays you'd go to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So if you have someone coming in later, you could check there and go through their information about citizenship. Ancestry. Ancestry does contain some information. They do have some, and they have them in different. They have a whole. They have a whole bunch of different data collections you can look through. On their website, and you can look at the Ancestry either using your personal account or at your local library, or we also have an Ancestry Library Edition account. So to sum it up, you want to know as much as possible about your ancestor to try to help you along with figure out the process. And of course, you want to read and study the source information on immigration and naturalization records to become familiar with the process and to help you figure out where would be the most likely place to look for information about your ancestor. And that concludes our program about immigration and naturalization. Thank you.